Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey back in time, not to mighty battles or grand castles, but right into the very kitchens and dining halls of the Middle Ages. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. You're walking through a smoky, bustling medieval town. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something that smells vaguely of stale cabbage and unidentifiable meat. You pass by a grimy stall where a vendor is hawking what looks suspiciously like a blackened, lumpy sausage. You feel a sudden pang of hunger and then a wave of nausea, because you quickly realize that your modern discerning palate and likely your stomach probably won't survive this trip. Seriously, what these folks considered a good meal might make your digestive system stage a full-scale revolt. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always wild to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in a rather cramped, dark dwelling, typical of a medieval peasant's home. The air is damp, and the only light comes from a small, sputtering fire in the hearth. The smell, you've quickly learned, is a constant companion. What immediately strikes you, if you were to peer into the humble larder, is the sheer, overwhelming presence of grain. It's everywhere. Sacks of it, sheaves of it, and the ever-present, sometimes slightly mouldy, loaves of bread. You see, for the vast majority of medieval society, especially the serfs and common folk, bread wasn't just part of the meal. It was the meal. It was the backbone, the filler, the utensil, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and gnawing hunger. Imagine your daily life revolving around the harvest. From dawn till dusk, you're toiling in the fields, your hands calloused, your back aching. And what fuels this relentless labor? Most likely, it's a coarse, dark loaf of bread, probably made from rye or barley, perhaps mixed with a bit of oats. This isn't your artisanal sourdough or fluffy white sliced bread. Oh no, this is heavy, dense, and often quite tough. It's designed to fill you up and stay with you, providing the slow-release energy needed for a day of back-breaking work. It's often baked in communal ovens, a social ritual in itself, where everyone brings their dough and waits for their turn. This shared baking process was a huge part of community life, a place where gossip was exchanged and friendships forged, all centered around the creation of this vital foodstuff. One of the more fascinating and frankly a bit disturbing quirks of medieval bread was its occasional role beyond mere sustenance. You might find yourself eating a trencher. No, not a trench of bread, but a trencher, which was literally a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate. You'd pile your meager stew or vegetables onto it, letting the bread soak up the juices, and then, when you were done, you'd either eat the soggy trencher or, more often, give it to your dog or the poor. Talk about zero waste. It's an ingenious, if not entirely appetizing, solution to the lack of proper dinnerware. And historians still argue whether the primary reason for trenchers was truly economic-saving on potteria, if it was a deliberate culinary choice to enhance the meal's flavors. The sheer volume of grain consumed was staggering. An average medieval person might consume several pounds of bread a day. Think about that for a second. That's a lot of carbs, even for someone doing intense manual labor. And while wheat was preferred, especially for the more affluent, it was often too expensive for the common person. So, rye, barley, and oats became the staples, sometimes mixed with legumes like peas or beans to stretch the flour further. The quality of your bread was often a direct indicator of your social standing. The finer, whiter bread made from sifted wheat flour was reserved for the nobility and the clergy, a symbol of their elevated status. Your bread, my friend, is probably a dark, hearty, and somewhat gritty affair, full of bran and whatever other bits snuck in during the milling process. You might even find the occasional pebble or insect adding an unexpected crunch. Just a little extra protein, right? This focus on grain meant that agricultural failures like a bad harvest were utterly catastrophic. Without the grain, there was no bread, and without bread, there was widespread famine. You can imagine the constant anxiety that must have permeated medieval life, knowing that your very survival hinged on the whims of the weather and the fertility of the land. It made every harvest a moment of profound relief, a temporary reprieve from the ever-present threat of starvation. From the painful throes of medieval hangovers, your journey through medieval indulgence now delves into a darker, often unacknowledged aspect: addiction. Forget your modern understanding of substance abuse as a disease. In medieval times, the pervasive availability and cultural acceptance of alcohol, coupled with a lack of medical knowledge, meant that alcoholism was a widespread, yet largely unrecognized and untreated problem. You'd quickly realize that escaping the bottle was almost impossible. Imagine a medieval person who drinks excessively. Perhaps they start with the common daily consumption of ale, then gradually increase to stronger wines, or in later periods the emerging distilled spirits. There were no public health campaigns, no support groups, and no scientific understanding of dependency. Someone drinking heavily would simply be labeled a drunkard, a sot, or perhaps prone to excess, seen as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. The sheer volume of alcohol consumed, even daily weak ale, could lead to chronic issues. For those who progressed to stronger beverages, the physical and mental deterioration would be severe. Imagine a man whose hands constantly tremble, whose face is flushed and bloated, whose memory is failing, but whose condition is simply seen as a character flaw, not a treatable illness. He might lose his job, his family might shun him, and he might end up in poverty, his decline attributed to personal weakness rather than a recognized addiction. A mainstream historical fact is the significant social problem of chronic alcoholism in medieval society, though it was not termed as such. Court records, moral treatises, and even popular literature frequently describe individuals whose lives were ruined by excessive drinking, leading to poverty, violence, and neglect of family. While a problem, it was rarely seen as a disease, but rather a vice requiring moral condemnation or religious penance. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about medieval treatments for excessive drinking, the use of anti-drinking charms or amulets. Some folk remedies and superstitions suggested wearing certain amulets, perhaps made of specific stones or dried animal parts, or reciting specific prayers or incantations believed to ward off the desire for drink. Imagine a desperate spouse secretly sewing a dried toad's leg into her husband's tunic, hoping it would curb his drinking. It highlights the blend of superstition and desperation in the absence of genuine medical understanding. Historians still argue whether these charms were primarily a reflection of popular superstition, a psychological placebo for those seeking self-control, or a cultural attempt to address a pervasive social problem through non-medical means. The lack of specialized care meant that individuals struggling with severe alcohol dependency had nowhere to turn for genuine help. They might be cared for by their families if still tolerated, or end up in workhouses or on the streets if their condition led to destitution. There were no detox facilities, no rehabilitation centers. The cycle of drinking, physical decline, and social marginalization was often unbroken. For the wealthy, while the consequences might be less immediate, they had resources to cushion their fall, chronic drinking could still lead to serious health problems, family strife, and a tarnished reputation. Gout, often exacerbated by rich diets and heavy drinking, was famously known as the rich man's disease. So, as you imagine the pervasive, often ignored, suffering of medieval alcoholics, their condition misdiagnosed as a moral failing, you realize that addiction was a silent epidemic. It was a world where a potent problem festered without understanding, leaving countless lives in its devastating wake. You'd certainly appreciate the modern understanding of addiction as a disease and the range of treatment and support services available today in Ho Chi Minh City, far removed from the moralistic judgments and lack of help in medieval time. It's early Saturday morning, and the thought of such unchecked dependency is quite sobering. As your journey through time continues, leaving the medieval peasant's humble kitchen behind, you suddenly find yourself in a bustling medieval town, but your focus isn't on the smells of the marketplace or the grand castle walls. Instead, you're acutely aware of the pervasive human odors, the general grime, and the undeniable truth about medieval beverages. You're about to discover why drinking water was risky business, often making alcoholic alternatives not just pleasurable, but a matter of survival. Imagine needing a drink in medieval times. Your first thought wouldn't be to grab a glass of refreshing tap water. Oh no, the water available, especially in towns and cities, was often dangerously unhygienic. Wells could be contaminated by seepage from nearby cesspits or overflowing drain. Rivers, while seemingly pure, often served as convenient dumping grounds for human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial effluents from tanneries or dye works upstream. Picture a medieval river looking murky and smelling foul as your primary water source. It sounds utterly unappetizing and terrifying, doesn't it? Consuming this raw, untreated water was a direct path to illness. Without any understanding of germ theory, people regularly ingested bacteria and parasites that caused debilitating and often fatal diseases. Dysentery, also known as the bloody flux, was a common and terrifying killer, leading to severe dehydration and death. Typhoid and cholera also ravaged populations, directly linked to contaminated water supply. Imagine constantly battling stomach cramps, fever, and the grim possibility that your next drink could be your last. A mainstream historical fact is the direct link between contaminated water sources and widespread epidemics of waterborne diseases throughout the medieval period. These diseases were major killers, particularly in densely populated urban centers where sanitation was rudimentary, highlighting the critical role of safe drinking water, or its absence, in public health. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about perceived water quality, the sweetness of well water. Medieval people often judged the quality of water by its taste and clarity. Sweet-tasting well water was often considered superior and safer than bitter or cloudy alternatives. However, a sweet taste could in fact sometimes indicate contamination, as certain organic pollutants can alter flavor without necessarily making it visibly dirty. Imagine choosing your water based purely on taste, unknowingly selecting a dangerous beverage. It was a subtle, yet potentially deadly deception. Historians still argue whether the preference for sweet water had any scientific basis related to certain minerals, or if it was purely a subjective measure that offered a false sense of security. This constant threat from water meant that fermented beverages, particularly ale and wine, became staple drinks for all ages and social classes. The process of brewing ale or making wine involved boiling water, for ale, or fermentation, for wine, both of which killed many of the harmful pathogens present in raw water. So, inadvertently, a mug of weak ale was often a safer hydration choice than a cup of well water. Imagine children drinking weak ale throughout the day, not for its intoxicating effect, but because it was the safest thing available. Access to truly clean water, from protected springs or sophisticated and rare aqueducts, was a luxury often reserved for monasteries or very wealthy households, and even those systems required meticulous maintenance to remain pure. For the vast majority, every drink was a subtle gamble. So, as you watch medieval people draw water from murky wells or sip their ale, you begin to grasp the profound challenge of basic hydration. It was a world where water, the very essence of life, was often a source of disease, subtly nudging everyone towards alcoholic alternatives. You'd certainly appreciate your purified, piped water delivered directly to your tap in Ho Chi Minh City after experiencing the constant threat of medieval drinking water. That's a modern convenience we truly take for granted. From the risky business of medieval drinking water, your journey now flows seamlessly into the most ubiquitous beverage of the age, ale. Forget your craft beers and fancy lagers. Medieval ale was the daily bread of drink, a staple consumed by everyone from the lowliest peasant to the mightiest king, often from dawn till dusk. You'd quickly realize that for many, it was as fundamental as food itself. Imagine starting your day with a mug of ale. For the common person, particularly laborers, ale was a regular part of every meal and often drunk throughout the working day. It was a caloric supplement, providing much needed energy for grueling physical labor and a safer alternative to contaminated water. This wasn't highly alcoholic stuff. Most small ale was quite weak, with an alcohol content perhaps closer to 1–2%, similar to what we'd call near beer today. It was brewed to be drunk quickly and in large quantities. Imagine quenching your thirst with something that tasted vaguely of slightly sweet, yeasty, Unhopped liquid bread. Brewing was a household task for many, particularly women, who were often known as alewives. They'd brew ale in large wooden vats using malted barley or other grains like oats or rye, water and yeast. Hops, which give modern beer its bitterness and preservative qualities, were not widely used until the later medieval period. So medieval ale would have been sweeter, cloudier, and prone to spoiling quickly. Imagine a beverage that had to be consumed within days of brewing, or it would turn sour. A mainstream historical fact is the pervasive consumption of ale across all social classes, including by children. Because brewing involved boiling the water, ale was significantly safer to drink than raw water, especially in urban areas. Children would consume small ale or table beer, which was even weaker, but still provided hydration and calories without the risks of waterborne diseases. It was seen as nourishing and hydrating, not just intoxicating. Now for a rather quirky tidbit about the economic power of ale, the ale stake. An ale stake was a pole or stake, often with a bush or garland attached to it, erected outside an alehouse or private dwelling to signal that fresh ale was available for sale. Imagine walking through a medieval town and spotting these simple markers, letting you know where you could grab a refreshing and safe pint. It was an early form of advertising, a visual invitation to quench your thirst. Historians still argue whether the ale stake was primarily a practical marker for travelers, a symbolic sign of hospitality, or a subtle means for local authorities to identify and tax brewing establishments. The quality of ale varied wildly. It could range from a clear, relatively clean brew to a thick, murky concoction full of sediment and bits of grain. Stronger mighty ale or double ale was also brewed, often for special occasions or for the wealthy, offering a more potent buzz. But for the daily grind, it was the weaker, safer version that reigned supreme. Serving ale was also different. It was often poured directly from a barrel into wooden tankards or leather jacks, and communal drinking was common. Imagine clinking your wooden mug with friends, sharing the experience, the ale providing not just sustenance, but also a social lubricant in often challenging lives. So, as you lift your imaginary wooden tankard and take a long draught of this yeasty, slightly sweet liquid, you realize that medieval ale was far more than just a drink. It was a vital source of calories, a public health solution, and a central pillar of social life, consumed with a casualness that would shock your modern sensibilities. You'd certainly appreciate the dizzying array of carefully regulated, clear and perfectly carbonated beers in Ho Chi Minh City today after experiencing the daily medieval ale. It's truly a different kind of daily brew. From the ubiquitous presence of daily ale, your journey through medieval libations now turns to a more refined, yet equally potent, beverage. Wine. Forget cheap plonk or mass-produced bottles. Medieval wine ranged wildly in quality, from common local vintages to highly prized imports, and its significance often depended directly on your social status. You'd quickly realize that wine wasn't just a drink, it was a powerful symbol. Imagine yourself at a medieval feast, or even just a simple inn. If you were a peasant, your access to wine would be limited and dependent on your region. In wine-producing areas like parts of France, Italy, or Germany, even common folk might drink a simple, rough local vintage, often consumed very young and unaged. This would be a cloudy, perhaps tart, drink, far from the complex bouquets of modern fine wines. Imagine a wine that tasted more like fermented grape juice without the years of careful aging. It was consumed more for sustenance and safety than for connoisseurship. For the nobility and the wealthy, wine was a different matter entirely. Fine wines, particularly from renowned regions like Bordeaux, Burgundy, or the Rhine, were highly prized and incredibly expensive imports. These would be stored in cellars, carefully transported, and served with great ceremony. Imagine the rich, deep color of a claret, or the golden hue of a sweeter white wine poured into an ornate goblet. This was a clear display of wealth and sophisticated taste. A mainstream historical fact is that wine was often seen as a superior and more aristocratic drink than ale, particularly outside of ale-producing region. Its production often required specific climates and more skilled agricultural practices, making it inherently more expensive to produce and transport. This made wine a potent symbol of social status, directly reflecting the wealth and connections of the drinker. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about medieval wine consumption, the practice of spicing wine. It was incredibly common, even among the nobility, to mix wine with spices, honey, or sugar, especially for entertainment or as a perceived digestive. This concoction was known as hypocras, or hypocras. Imagine a red wine infused with ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and cardamom, made even sweeter with honey. It sounds delicious, doesn't it? This wasn't just about taste. Spices were expensive, so adding them to wine was another way to display wealth, and it was also thought to aid digestion or mask the taste of less than perfect wine. Historians still argue whether the primary reason for spicing wine was truly for flavor and perceived health benefits, or if it was mainly to mask the taste of poorer quality or slightly spoiled wine. Serving wine also varied. For the wealthy, it would be poured into individual goblets. For others, particularly in taverns, communal drinking cups were common, passed around the table. The alcohol content could vary widely, but medieval wines were generally lighter in alcohol than many modern wines due to less controlled fermentation processes. However, drinking large quantities could certainly lead to intoxication. The cultivation of grapes and the production of wine were significant agricultural endeavors, often overseen by monasteries who produced wine for both religious ceremonies and commercial sale, or powerful landowners. The quality of a region's wine could be a source of immense pride and economic power. So, as you lift an imaginary goblet, whether it's filled with a rough local vintage or a richly spiced hypocras, you realize that medieval wine was a complex beverage. It was a drink of sustenance, a symbol of status, and a testament to agricultural skill, consumed in quantities that would make your head spin. You'd certainly appreciate the refined palates and controlled serving sizes of modern wine culture in Ho Chi Minh City, where a good Cabernet Sauvignon is celebrated for its purity, not its ability to mask questionable origins. From the robust world of medieval wine, your journey through ancient libations now takes a step back in time to an even older, honey-sweetened brew, mead. Forget beer or wine. For centuries before them, mead was the drink of celebration, of kings, and often of sheer potency. You'd quickly realize that this golden nectar held a special, almost mystical place in medieval drinking culture. Imagine a scene from an Anglo-Saxon hall or a Viking feast. Mead would be flowing freely from large drinking horns or communal bowls. This wasn't a casual daily drink for most. Its primary sweetener, honey, was a valuable commodity, making mead more expensive and often reserved for special occasions, celebrations, or for the wealthy. It was the drink of heroes, of poets, and of joyous gatherings. The air would be thick with the sweet, heady aroma of fermented honey, perhaps mingled with spices. Mead is essentially fermented honey and water, sometimes with added fruits, spices, or grains for flavor. The alcohol content could vary widely, from a light, sparkling mead similar to cider to a potent, heavy brew that could rival strong wine. Unlike wine, which relies on grape harvests, mead could be made almost anywhere there was honey and water, making it popular in regions where grapevines didn't thrive, particularly in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Anglo-Saxon England, parts of Eastern Europe. Imagine a medieval beekeeper proudly turning his golden harvest into a powerful, intoxicating drink. A mainstream historical fact is that mead is one of the oldest alcoholic beverages known to humankind, with evidence of its consumption dating back thousands of years before wine or beer. Its deep roots in ancient cultures gave it a mythical and ritualistic significance, often associated with gods, warriors, and poetry, particularly in Norse and Celtic traditions. It was seen as a drink of wisdom and inspiration. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about mead's perceived effects, the origin of the term honeymoon. While the exact etymology is debated, one popular theory connects honeymoon to medieval traditions of newly married couples drinking mead for a full moon cycle after their wedding. Mead was believed to promote fertility and virility, ensuring the couple quickly conceived a child. Imagine being compelled to drink large quantities of a sweet, potent alcoholic beverage every night for a month, all for the sake of fertility. It sounds like a rather boozy and perhaps forced post-nuptial celebration. Historians still argue whether the honeymoon tradition was primarily a fertility ritual, a period of secluded marital bonding, or a festive extension of wedding celebrations. Brewing mead was often a task performed by women in the household or by specialized brewers. It required patience, as the fermentation process could be slow and the results sometimes unpredictable, but a well-made mead was highly prized, often served in special drinking vessels that added to its ceremonial nature. For many, mead represented a taste of the divine, a connection to ancient traditions, and a potent source of merriment. It was a drink that brought people together for feasts, storytelling, and communal joy. Its sweetness offered a pleasant contrast to the often bitter realities of medieval life. So, as you imagine lifting a carved drinking horn filled with sweet golden mead, feeling its warmth spread through you, you realize that this ancient beverage was more than just fermented honey. It was a symbol of celebration, of ancient heritage, and a powerful elixir of merriment. You'd certainly appreciate the refined simplicity of your modern celebratory drinks in Ho Chi Minh City after experiencing the potent, almost mythical charm of medieval mead. It's Wednesday morning now, and the thought of starting your day with mead is quite a humorous one, given its potency. From the honey-sweet potency of mead, your journey through medieval libations now takes a significant, though slow, evolutionary leap. The emergence of distilled spirits. Forget your refined whiskies and vodkas. In the medieval period, these stronger alcoholic beverages were a relatively new phenomenon, often associated with medicine or alchemy before they became widespread as recreational drinks. You'd quickly realize that getting really wasted was about to get a whole lot easier and potentially more dangerous. Imagine a medieval alchemist's workshop filled with strange retorts, alembics, and bubbling concoctions. This is often where the earliest forms of distilled spirits, often referred to as aquavitae, water of life, or brandy, from brandewine, burnt wine, first appeared in Europe around the 12th century. Initially, distillation was primarily used for medicinal purposes, believed to extract the essence of substances and create powerful remedies or elixirs. Imagine a monk or a scholar carefully distilling wine, believing they were creating a potent medicine, not a recreational drink. It was a fascinating crossover between early science and practical application. These early spirits would have been crude and unrefined by modern standards, lacking the careful aging and filtration processes that give modern spirits their smoothness. They would have been harsh, potent, and often flavored with herbs and spices to mask their raw taste or enhance their perceived medicinal qualities. Imagine a fiery, unaged spirit, perhaps smelling strongly of yeast and raw alcohol. A far cry from a smooth single malt. A mainstream historical fact is that distillation techniques were introduced to medieval Europe from the Islamic world, where they had been developed for medicinal, alchemical, and perfumery purposes. The knowledge of separating alcohol from fermented liquids gradually spread, first through medical schools and monasteries, before its recreational potential was fully recognized and exploited in the later Middle Ages. This transfer of knowledge was a crucial moment in the history of alcohol production. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about the early uses of these potent spirits, their role as anesthetics for surgery. Before the development of modern anesthesia, a strong swig of aqua vitae might be given to a patient about to undergo an agonizing procedure like an amputation or a tooth extraction in a desperate attempt to dull the pain or induce unconsciousness. Imagine being offered a raw, fiery spirit as your only pain relief before a medieval surgery. It speaks volumes about the brutal realities of medicine then, and the raw power of these new spirits. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of administering alcohol before surgery was genuinely for pain relief to induce a state of shock that made the patient less responsive, or simply as a compassionate gesture in the face of inevitable agony. The widespread recreational consumption of distilled spirits came later, often from the 15th century onwards, as production methods became more common and efficient. They were more concentrated, easier to transport, and offered a more potent form of intoxication than ale or wine. This led to new social dynamics and, inevitably, new problems associated with drunkenness. The production of spirits often required specialized equipment and skills. distinguishing it from simpler home brewing. Monasteries and alchemists initially guarded these secrets, but the knowledge gradually disseminated, leading to local production of brandies and eventually early forms of whiskey and gin. So, as you imagine the fiery taste of aqua vitae, a new kind of potent brew slowly entering the medieval consciousness, you realize that the concept of getting wasted was about to undergo a significant transformation. It was a world on the cusp of discovering more potent forms of intoxication, with all the social consequences that would entail. You'd certainly appreciate the regulated purity and controlled strengths of modern spirits in Ho Chi Minh City today, a far cry from these raw, experimental concoctions. It's still Tuesday night here, and thankfully, you're not trying to get your dental work done with a shot of medieval water of life. From the emerging potency of distilled spirits, your journey through medieval revelry now leads you to the very heart of common social life. Taverns and alehouses. Forget your quiet, dimly lit pubs. Medieval public drinking establishments were noisy, bustling, and often raucous social hubs, serving as centres for news, gossip, and communal merriment. You'd quickly realise that these places were far more than just bars. They were vital community spaces. Imagine stepping into a medieval tavern or alehouse. The air would be thick with the smell of stale ale, wood smoke, sweat, and cheap food. It would be dimly lit by flickering candles or a central fire, casting dancing shadows. The noise would be considerable. The clatter of pottery mugs, boisterous laughter, shouted conversations, and perhaps the crude strumming of a lute or the singing of a bawdy song. This was not a place for quiet contemplation. Taverns and alehouses served as meeting places for all sorts of people. Local peasants unwinding after a day's labour, travelling merchants seeking news or lodging, soldiers on leave, and even discreetly members of the clergy. They were informal social centres where news was exchanged, deals were struck, and grievances were aired. Imagine trying to conduct a serious conversation amidst the boisterous din, or simply trying to enjoy your drink without being drawn into a lively debate or a fistfight. A mainstream historical fact is the central role of alehouses and taverns as community hubs for the common people in medieval England and much of Europe. They were not just places to drink. They served as informal courts, places for hiring labour, post offices for messages, and centres for local gossip and political discussion. For many, especially those without large homes, they were an extension of their living space, a public parlour. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about medieval tavern culture, the score or tally stick. Before widespread literacy and standardised bookkeeping, tavern keepers would often keep a record of a customer's tab using a tally stick. This was a piece of wood notched with marks, indicating the amount owed. The stick would then be split down the middle, with the customer receiving one half, the stock, and the tavern keeper retaining the other, the foil, ensuring a matching record. Imagine leaving a tavern with half a notch stick in your pocket, representing your growing debt. It sounds utterly primitive, but surprisingly secure, as tampering with one half would be obvious. Historians still argue whether the tally stick system was primarily a practical solution for illiteracy, a form of communal trust, or if its public nature inadvertently encouraged more drinking by making debts visible. The drinks served would primarily be ale, often brewed on the premises, along with local wines in wine-producing regions. Food would be simple and hearty: bread, cheese, perhaps some stew, or roasted meat if the establishment had a cook. The quality varied wildly, from respectable establishments to unsavoury dives. Gambling with dice or cards was common, adding to the lively, sometimes volatile, atmosphere. Fights could break out, particularly fueled by excessive drinking. The police presence was minimal, so disputes were often settled by the patrons themselves or by the tavern keeper's hired muscle. You were largely on your own. So, as you jostle through the crowded, smoky interior of a medieval tavern, listening to the cacophony of voices and the clinking of mugs, you realize that these were vibrant, unfiltered spaces of social interaction. It was a world where public intoxication was common, and community life often revolved around the bottom of a mug. You'd certainly appreciate the relative calm and varied menu of your modern Ho Chi Minh City bar, with its polite service and clear tab system after experiencing the raw, unfiltered energy of a medieval alehouse. It's Tuesday night, and the idea of a quiet beer sounds pretty good. From the boisterous commonality of taverns and alehouses, your journey through medieval libations now elevates to a different scale of indulgence. Royal feasts, forget your average dinner party. Medieval royal banquets were lavish, multi-day spectacles of conspicuous consumption, designed to display immense wealth, power, and generosity with an almost endless supply of tipple. You'd quickly realize that getting wasted was not just permitted but almost expected at these grand events. Imagine yourself as a guest at a royal feast in a great castle hall. The sheer volume of alcohol consumed was staggering. Large wooden barrels of ale and fine wine would be rolled in continuously, poured into pitchers, and then into individual goblets or shared drinking horns. There was rarely a moment when a guest's cup would be empty. The flow was constant, from the moment guests arrived until they were practically carried to their beds. Imagine endless refills of potent beverages, encouraging a steady march towards intoxication. These feasts were not just about food and drink. They were political events, opportunities for networking, for celebrating victories, or for making important announcements. The more lavish the spread of food and the more abundant the flow of alcohol, the greater the prestige of the host. Imagine the king presiding over the hall, subtly encouraging more drinking, knowing that it contributed to the atmosphere of revelry and demonstrated his boundless generosity. It was a very literal way to drink to the king's health. A mainstream historical fact is the immense quantities of food and drink consumed at medieval royal feasts, often leading to widespread gluttony and excessive intoxication. Records from royal households show colossal provisions of ale, wine, and spirits for these events, with guests often drinking for hours across multiple courses. The sheer scale was a deliberate display of power and wealth. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about managing the inevitable royal hangovers, the Chamberlain of the Buttery and the morning after supplies. In large noble households and royal courts, there was a specific official, the Chamberlain of the Buttery, responsible for the provisions of drinks. Their duties would extend to ensuring there were sufficient morning after supplies for the royal household and guests, often including fresh bread, cold ale, believed to ease hangovers, and sometimes special herbal concoctions. Imagine a designated staff member whose job was literally to help the nobility recover from their epic hangovers. It certainly shows a pragmatic approach to the consequences of royal revelry. Historians still argue whether the provision of specific hangover cures was primarily a practical necessity due to the commonness of heavy drinking, or if it was a subtle form of luxury and indulgence for the elite. Entertainment was woven into the feasting and drinking. Minstrels would play music, jesters would perform antics, and acrobats or mummers might entertain guests between courses, all designed to keep the mood festive and encourage further indulgence. The atmosphere was one of joyful excess, often loud and boisterous, with polite decorum giving way to unrestrained merriment as the evening wore on. The drinks themselves would range from various strengths of ale to local and imported wines, and particularly in the later medieval period, the newly emerging distilled spirits, aqua vitae. This potent mix ensured a rapid progression from tipsiness to full-blown intoxication for many. The lack of clean water also meant that consuming alcohol was simply the safest, most calorie-efficient way to stay hydrated and energized throughout a long event. So, as you imagine yourself raising a goblet in a toast, feeling the potent effects of endless refills of ale and wine, surrounded by loud revelry, you realize that medieval royal feasts were an exercise in controlled or uncontrolled excess. It was a world where getting wasted was a celebrated part of showing off power and hospitality, with few of the social stigmas that might accompany such behavior today. You'd certainly appreciate the concept of a last call and responsible drinking in your modern Ho Chi Minh City after experiencing the endless flow of a medieval royal banquet. This Tuesday night, your quiet evening feels infinitely more manageable. From the boisterous excess of royal feasts, your journey through medieval drinking now turns to a more spiritual, yet equally pervasive aspect: religious drinking. Forget strict abstinence. In the Middle Ages, alcohol, particularly wine and ale, held a significant and often central place within monastic life during religious ceremonies and for pilgrims on their sacred journeys. You'd quickly realize that even piety had its potent libations. Imagine a medieval monastery. While monks and nuns lived lives of austerity and devotion, this didn't mean they were teetotalers. On the contrary, monastic communities were often at the forefront of brewing and winemaking, producing these beverages not just for their own consumption, but also for sale and hospitality. Monks would consume ale daily, often a weak small ale, as a safe and nourishing alternative to water, particularly as they often maintained strict hygiene standards for their brewing to ensure purity for their community. Wine was, of course, essential for the Eucharist, the central ritual of the Mass. The rules of monastic orders sometimes even prescribed specific allowances for ale or wine, recognizing their role in sustenance and, subtly, as a comfort in a rigorous life. Imagine a monk diligently copying a manuscript, periodically taking a draught from his wooden mug of ale, sustaining himself through hours of scholarly work. It was a practical necessity. A mainstream historical fact is the significant role of medieval monasteries as centers of brewing and winemaking. Monastic communities perfected brewing techniques, cultivating hops in later periods, and developing new grape varietal. Their production often supplied not just their own needs, but also served as a major commercial enterprise, contributing significantly to the medieval economy and the development of European brewing and winemaking traditions. Many modern breweries and vineyards trace their origins back to medieval monasteries. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about alcohol and religious observance, the Saints' Day feast. While fast days required abstinence from meat, eggs, and dairy, many Saints' Days were celebrated with feasts where alcohol flowed freely. These were joyous occasions of communal celebration and spiritual thanksgiving, where the usual dietary restrictions were lifted. Imagine celebrating the feast day of your patron saint with copious amounts of ale and wine, perhaps even a stronger brew, as a spiritual and social act. It shows a fascinating balance between asceticism and celebration within medieval Christianity. Historians still argue whether the revelry associated with Saints' Day feasts was primarily a spontaneous outpouring of joy, a controlled release from daily strictures, or a subtle way for the church to maintain popular appeal by allowing periods of licensed indulgence. Pilgrims too consumed alcohol on their arduous journeys to holy sites. Inns and hospices along pilgrim routes would provide pilgrims with ale and wine, offering sustenance, warmth, and a brief respite from the rigors of travel. Alcohol was also seen as a way to fortify oneself against the elements and the dangers of the road. Even the process of creating and consuming alcohol could be imbued with religious significance. Blessings would be offered over harvests, and prayers said during brewing. The shared communion of drinking, particularly for celebrations, could reinforce community bonds and a sense of shared faith. So, as you imagine a silent monk sipping his carefully brewed ale or a group of weary pilgrims raising a toast at an inn, you realize that alcohol in the Middle Ages was far from just a secular pleasure. It was deeply intertwined with spiritual life, a source of sustenance, community, and celebration, even within the confines of devout religious practice. You'd certainly appreciate the clear separation of religious and secular drinking in your modern life in Ho Chi Minh City after experiencing alcohol's pervasive religious presence. Then it's early Wednesday morning, and the thought of a monastic brew is a rather unusual start to the day. From the spiritual and social role of religious drinking, your journey through medieval intoxication now turns to the attempts, often sporadic and largely ineffective, by authorities to manage its excesses, laws and regulation. Forget strict licensing laws and designated driving. Medieval society had a complicated relationship with public drunkenness, leading to early, often quaint, efforts to control brewing, consumption, and the inevitable rowdiness. You'd quickly realize that outright prohibition was rarely the answer. Imagine a medieval town mayor attempting to control the flow of ale. While drinking was ubiquitous and largely accepted, excessive drunkenness leading to violence, public disorder, or neglect of duties was frowned upon. Early regulations often focused on the quality of the ale and bread, ensuring honest measures and ingredients rather than the quantity consumed. A size of ale and bread was a common law that set standards and prices, aiming to protect consumers from unscrupulous brewers and bakers. Imagine an official inspecting barrels of ale, tasting it for quality, or checking the size of a loaf of bread, all to maintain public order and fairness. Laws might also target tippling during church services or working hours, or excessive noise and revelry at alehouses late at night. Punishments for public drunkenness or associated disorderly conduct could range from fines to time in the stocks or pillory, a public humiliation. Imagine spending a day with your head and hands locked in a wooden frame in the town square, exposed to public ridicule, as punishment for a night of too much ale. It sounds like a rather effective, if uncomfortable, deterrent. A mainstream historical fact is the gradual development of local ordinances and royal decrees attempting to regulate the brewing and sale of alcohol in medieval towns. These regulations were often driven by concerns over public order, revenue collection through taxes on brewing, and ensuring fair trade, rather than a moralistic condemnation of alcohol consumption itself. They represented early forms of consumer protection and social control. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about unusual medieval penalties for bad brewers, the tumbrel or ducking stool for dishonest alewives. If an alewife, a female brewer and seller, was found to be selling short measures, diluted ale, or an inferior product, she might be subjected to public humiliation. This could involve being paraded through the streets with her faulty products, or more dramatically being strapped to a tumbrel, a cart, and dragged through the mud or tied to a ducking stool and repeatedly submerged in a pond or river. Imagine facing such public shaming for a watery pint. It highlights the immediate physical nature of medieval justice. Historians still argue whether the ducking stool was primarily a punitive measure, a form of public spectacle, or a gendered punishment specifically targeting women in the brewing trade. Licensing, as you know it, was rudimentary. Alehouses might simply need local permission, or the brewer might pay a tax. The concept of hours of operation was less strict, with many establishments simply opening when there was demand and closing when customers or their money ran out. Enforcement was often lax, relying on local officials or citizens to report infractions. The growth of towns led to a proliferation of drinking establishments, making true control difficult. While authorities might try to manage the worst excesses of public drunkenness, the pervasive nature of alcohol consumption meant that complete suppression was neither practical nor desirable. Alcohol was too ingrained in the economy, social life, and diet. So, as you imagine the mayor inspecting an ale barrel, or witnessing a dishonest brewer being paraded through the streets, you realize that medieval laws around alcohol were a fascinating mix of pragmatism and public humiliation. It was a world where authorities attempted to manage, rather than eliminate, the pervasive presence of drink, with often very direct and public consequences for offenders. You'd certainly appreciate the complex legal frameworks and generally more private forms of punishment in Ho Chi Minh City today after experiencing such medieval justice. It's Thursday, and the thought of a ducking stool is quite the wake-up call for those who might overpour. From the attempts at regulating medieval drinking, your journey now turns to the often unbridled consequences of all that consumption. Drunken behavior, forget the relatively contained antics of a modern pub crawl. In medieval times, intoxication was common, often public, and while sometimes accepted with a shrug, it could also lead to violence, social disruption, and lasting consequences. You'd quickly realize that getting wasted had a very different social context. Imagine a medieval feast or a busy tavern late at night. As the ale and wine flowed freely, inhibitions would lower, and the atmosphere could quickly escalate from jovial merriment to loud boisterousness, and even outright aggression. You'd witness men, and sometimes women, becoming increasingly unsteady on their feet, slurring their words and engaging in loud, often repetitive conversations. Laughter might turn into shouting, and arguments could easily spiral into brawls, fueled by alcohol and simmering resentments. Public drunkenness was far more visible and, in many contexts, more socially tolerated than it might be today. It was simply a common sight. while extreme belligerence could lead to intervention by a tavern keeper or local authorities. As we explored, a general state of tipsiness, or even outright inebriation, was often accepted as a natural outcome of social gatherings. Imagine a street where staggering figures were a normal sight after a market day or a local festival. It speaks to a different societal standard of what constituted acceptable public behavior. A mainstream historical fact is the high incidence of alcohol-related violence and public disorder in medieval towns and cities. Court records and chronicles frequently describe brawls, assaults, and even murders that occurred in or near taverns, directly attributed to excessive drinking. Alcohol was a major contributing factor to crime and social unrest, particularly among the lower classes. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about medieval social expectations and drunkenness, the drunkard's cloak or sober cloak. In some medieval towns, a rather humiliating public punishment for repeated drunkenness involved forcing the offender to wear a large, heavy barrel open at both ends, like a cloak or tunic. Imagine trying to walk through town, the weight of a barrel on your shoulders, enduring public mockery and ridicule. It was a physical and symbolic punishment designed to shame individuals into sobriety. Historians still argue whether the drunkard's cloak was primarily an effective deterrent, a public spectacle for moral instruction, or simply a form of ritualized humiliation for those who defied social norms around sobriety. Drunkenness could also lead to unfortunate accidents. Falls, drowning, especially near rivers or moats, or even accidental fires started by careless handling of candles or torches were all risks associated with heavy drinking. The lack of modern safety standards meant that even a simple stumble could have serious consequences. For the lower classes, drunkenness offered a temporary escape from the grinding hardships of daily life. It was a form of self-medication, a way to numb the pain of hunger, exhaustion, or despair. For the wealthy, it was a component of lavish feasts, a symbol of indulgence and freedom from restraint. The morning after, as you can imagine, would be brutal, with no readily available pain relievers beyond perhaps more alcohol or dubious herbal remedies, which we'll touch on next. The cycle of excessive drinking, temporary oblivion, and painful recovery was a familiar rhythm in medieval life. So, as you imagine yourself navigating a boisterous tavern, or perhaps witnessing a staggering figure being led away, you realize that medieval drunkenness was a pervasive part of the social fabric. It was a world where the lines of acceptable behavior were drawn differently, and the consequences, while often grim, were met with a mix of tolerance, public shaming, and continued indulgence. You'd certainly appreciate the clear social boundaries and consequences around alcohol consumption in Ho Chi Minh City today after that immersive experience. It's Friday evening now, and a quiet drink sounds far more appealing than a medieval pub crawl. From the boisterous, often grim, reality of medieval drunken behavior, your journey through medieval indulgence now turns to the desperate attempts to alleviate its inevitable consequence: hangover cures. Forget your modern pain relievers and electrolyte drinks. Medieval remedies for the morning after were often quaint, sometimes bizarre, and largely ineffective, highlighting a profound lack of scientific understanding of the body's recovery process. You'd quickly realize that a medieval hangover was a truly agonizing experience. Imagine waking up after a night of copious ale or wine consumption. Your head would be throbbing, your stomach churning, and a general malaise would encompass your entire being. Without modern analgesics like ibuprofen or paracetamol, you'd be left to suffer the full, unmitigated force of the hangover. The light would seem too bright, every sound too loud, and the thought of food utterly repulsive. What would be offered as a cure? Traditional folk remedies were common. A hair of the dog approach, meaning drinking more of the same alcohol that caused the hangover, was often surprisingly popular, believed to delay or ease the pain, though it merely prolonged the inevitable. Imagine forcing down another mug of murky ale when your stomach is already revolting. It sounds less like a cure and more like a cruel joke, doesn't it? A mainstream historical fact is the widespread belief in the humoral theory guiding medieval medicine, even for common ailments like hangovers. Hangovers would likely be attributed to an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, leading to treatments designed to restore balance, often through purges, emetics to induce vomiting, or even bloodletting. Imagine seeking a cure for a headache and being offered a strong laxative or a session with leeches. This pseudo-scientific approach often made the suffering worse. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about a particularly unusual medieval hangover remedy, the fried canary. Some medieval texts reflecting a more fantastical approach to medicine suggest that eating a fried canary could cure a hangover. Imagine having a pounding headache and a queasy stomach, only to be presented with a greasy cooked songbird. The very thought might be enough to make you truly sick, perhaps effectively curing the hangover by inducing vomiting. It's a bizarre example of the lengths to which people would go, reflecting a blend of desperation and odd folk beliefs. Historians still argue whether such extreme remedies like the fried canary were ever truly widespread practices, or if they were largely humorous anecdotes or theoretical suggestions recorded in medical texts. Other common remedies included eating salty foods like salted herring, which might have offered some hydration, or consuming strong, peppery broths. Herbal teas, often made with willow bark, which contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, or other soothing herbs, might offer mild relief, but nothing close to modern pain management. Rest and time were truly the only effective cure. The morning after would also be a time for public contemplation of one's misdeeds. If your drunkenness led to public disorder, as we discussed, the hangover might be compounded by a stint in the stocks or a public shaming ritual adding insult to injury. The consequences were both physical and social. So, as you imagine enduring a medieval hangover, battling a throbbing head and a queasy stomach with remedies like stale ale or, heaven forbid, a fried canary, you realize that recovery from medieval excess was a truly unpleasant ordeal. It was a world where pain was an inescapable part of life, and scientific understanding of the body's recovery was minimal. You'd certainly appreciate your modern pain relievers, electrolyte drinks, and the simple luxury of a quiet, dark room after that. Your modern morning routine in Ho Chi Minh City feels like a miracle of modern pharmacology. From the silent epidemic of medieval addiction, your journey through medieval revelry now turns to its most immediate and damaging consequences: violence and poverty. Forget quaint medieval festivals. Excessive drinking in the Middle Ages was a significant catalyst for social ills, leading to physical altercations, criminal behavior, and the steady descent into destitution for countless individuals and families. You'd quickly realize that getting wasted could have very grave repercussions. Imagine a busy medieval tavern, late at night, filled with men who have been drinking heavily for hours. Disagreements, often minor to begin with, could quickly escalate into heated arguments, then pushes, then fists, and eventually the drawing of knives or cudgels. Alcohol lowered inhibitions, inflamed tempers, and dulled judgment, turning minor slights into brutal brawls. You'd hear the shouts, the crashing of pottery mugs, and the screams of those caught in the crossfire. Violence, fueled by drink, was a common occurrence in and around public drinking establishments. Beyond spontaneous brawls, chronic drunkenness often led to more systemic violence within families. A man rendered aggressive by drink might abuse his wife or children, creating a cycle of fear and suffering within the home. Court records frequently document cases of domestic violence directly linked to alcohol consumption. Imagine the constant tension and terror for family members living with an alcoholic, with little recourse or protection. A mainstream historical fact is the clear correlation between alcohol consumption and crime rates in medieval towns, as evidenced by numerous court records and borough ordinances. Public drunkenness was frequently cited as a contributing factor in assaults, robberies, and breaches of the peace, leading authorities to implement regulations like curfews for alehouses in attempts to control associated criminal behavior. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about medieval justice and alcohol-fueled offences, the compurgation of drunkards. In some legal systems, particularly earlier ones, an accused person might clear their name through compurgation, having a number of oath helpers swear to their innocence or good character. However, if a person was known to be a habitual drunkard, finding oath helpers might be difficult, or their oaths would carry less weight, making it harder for them to escape punishment for alcohol-related offences. Imagine your reputation for heavy drinking preventing your friends from vouching for you in court. It highlights how drunkenness, while tolerated to a degree, could severely undermine one's standing in the community and legal system. Historians still argue whether the difficulty of compurgation for drunkards was primarily a practical legal hurdle or a subtle form of societal shaming and ostracization for chronic abusers. Poverty was another major consequence. A man who spent all his wages on drink would leave his family destitute, unable to afford food, rent, or basic necessities. Chronic absenteeism from work due to hangovers or drunkenness could lead to job loss, plunging individuals and families into a spiral of destitution. For women, if their husbands became drunkards, their own precarious economic situation would be made even worse, often forcing them into desperate measures, including begging or, in extreme cases, prostitution. The social fabric itself could be frayed by widespread alcohol abuse. Communities relied on mutual support, and individuals who consistently failed their duties due to drink would become a burden, leading to resentment and isolation. Workhouses where the utterly destitute ended up were often filled with those whose lives had been ruined by unchecked drinking. So, as you imagine the shattered pottery of a tavern brawl, the despair in a family struggling with a drunkard, or the grim reality of poverty born from excess, you realize that medieval intoxication carried severe, often inescapable, social costs. It was a world where the lines between acceptable revelry and destructive abuse were blurred, leading to widespread human suffering. You'd certainly appreciate the modern understanding of addiction and the support systems for victims of alcohol-related violence in Ho Chi Minh City today, far removed from the raw, brutal consequences of medieval getting wasted. It's Saturday night here, and thankfully such destructive behaviors are generally addressed with more compassion and intervention. From the grim consequences of medieval violence and poverty fueled by drink, your journey through medieval revelry now turns to a more convivial, yet equally intoxicating aspect: drinking games and pastime. Forget your subtle pub quizzes or quiet conversations. In the Middle Ages, alcohol was often central to communal entertainment, fostering boisterous games, lively storytelling, and a very hands-on approach to merriment. You'd quickly realize that a medieval party could get very messy very fast. Imagine a group of medieval people gathered in a tavern or a private hall. The ale and wine flow freely, and as inhibitions lower, the focus turns to games and shared activities. Drinking games designed to encourage consumption were common. These could involve challenges where the loser had to drink a penalty, or communal songs where participants drank on cue. Imagine a group roaring with laughter as one person struggles through a particularly difficult challenge, knowing the price of failure is another full mug of ale. Beyond formal games, many pastimes naturally led to heavy drinking. Storytelling, a popular form of entertainment, often involved long rambling tales interspersed with communal drinking. Singing, often bawdy and raucous, was a constant feature of any gathering, with mugs raised in toast or emptied in unison. Imagine a raucous sing-along, everyone swaying, arms linked, the room filled with the smell of stale ale and joyous, if off-key, voices. A mainstream historical fact is the central role of communal feasting and drinking as primary forms of entertainment and social bonding across all social classes in medieval society. These gatherings, often fueled by copious amounts of alcohol, served as vital opportunities for community cohesion, celebration, and the informal exchange of news and gossip, particularly in an era without mass media. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about a particularly odd medieval drinking game, Flicking the Fly. This involved a player dropping a live fly into their drink, taking a gulp, and then trying to flick the fly out with their finger before taking another sip. If they failed, or if the fly was consumed, they would typically have to drink another large measure. Imagine the sheer absurdity and lack of hygiene of such a game. It highlights the often crude, yet undeniably social, nature of their pastime. Historians still argue whether flicking the fly was a common and widespread game or a more extreme, perhaps apocryphal, anecdote illustrating the depths of medieval boisterousness. Gambling was also a popular pastime, with dice and card games often played in taverns, often accompanied by heavy drinking. Wagers would be made, fortunes won and lost, adding another layer of excitement and potential conflict to the atmosphere. Cheating was common, and disputes could easily escalate into brawls, especially when fueled by alcohol. The atmosphere in these gatherings was often boisterous and unrefined. Table manners, if any were even attempted, would quickly dissolve, and decorum would give way to unrestrained merriment. The objective was simply to enjoy oneself, to forget the hardships of daily life, and to revel in the company of others. The consequences, as we've seen, often included violence, accidents, and a brutal hangover the next day. But in the moment, the sheer communal joy, the temporary escape from reality, and the powerful bonding experience were clearly worth the risks for many. Alcohol served as a profound social lubricant, dissolving barriers and fostering a shared sense of revelry. So, as you hear the imagined shouts of laughter and the clinking of mugs, perhaps even the splash of a fly in a drink, you realize that medieval drinking games and pastimes were a vibrant, if often chaotic, part of the social fabric. It was a world where getting wasted was a communal activity, a joyous plunge into shared oblivion. You'd certainly appreciate the modern concept of responsible drinking and the diverse, less messy forms of entertainment available to you in Ho Chi Minh City today, after this glimpse into medieval revelry. Sweet dreams, 300-word wind-up. As the last echoes of clinking medieval mugs and raucous laughter fade, let your mind gently drift from the smoky taverns and bustling feasts of the past. Imagine the quiet hum of your own room now, the soft glow of your bedside lamp, a stark contrast to the flickering candlelight and overwhelming smells of those ancient times. You've journeyed through a world where water was often dangerous, and ale was a safer, calorie-rich staple consumed from dawn till dusk. A world where wine symbolized status and mead promised fertility, where early distilled spirits first emerged from alchemical still. You've glimpsed the vibrant, often chaotic, social hubs of alehouses, the grand excess of royal banquets, and even the spiritual role of drink in monastic life. You've seen the quaint attempts at regulation, the brutal realities of drunken behavior, and the bizarre, ineffective attempts at hangover cure. And perhaps most sobering, you've understood the silent epidemic of addiction that plagued medieval society, largely unrecognized and untreated, leading to cycles of violence and poverty. But now, as you lie in your comfortable bed, surrounded by the modern conveniences of clean water and safe, regulated beverages, let the lessons of the past simply settle. Feel the cool air from your fan, a gentle breeze against your skin, far from the medieval stench and chill. Your own health and well-being, your access to safe water, your understanding of social responsibility, these are not accidental. They are the slow, hard-won legacies of those who lived and struggled, and perhaps, occasionally, got wasted in medieval times. Take a deep, peaceful breath. You are safe, you are warm, and you are clean. The challenges of their world are far behind you. Let your mind clear and ease into a restful sleep, knowing that some battles, thankfully, have already been fought and won. End of script. Sweet dreams.